Imagine being on a flight where a millionaire's baby cries nonstop, the father is helpless, the passengers are frustrated, and nobody knows what to do. Then, out of nowhere, a poor black boy does something no one expects, something that silences the plane and leaves everyone stunned. This isn't just about a crying baby, it's about dignity, compassion, and the power of being black in a world that underestimates us. On this channel, Black Struggle, we share stories like this, stories of prejudice, survival, and quiet victories that show our strength. If you've ever felt overlooked, judged, or doubted, you'll see yourself here. Subscribe now and join a community that stands for respect, truth, and justice. The cabin doors had just closed, and the hum of the engines was starting to rise when a sound cut through the air, sharp, piercing, and relentless. A baby had started crying in the first-class cabin, and within seconds, every head turned. The sound was raw, filled with desperation, the kind of cry that makes it impossible to ignore. The child's father, a tall man in an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His cufflinks gleamed as he tried to rock the child against his shoulder, whispering words that never found their way past the noise. Passengers exchanged glances. Some tightened their jaw, others sighed and pulled their headphones higher. The attendants moved quickly, one offering a bottle of warm milk, another suggesting a different seat where the baby might calm down. Nothing worked. The baby's cries only grew louder, echoing off the walls of the plane as if the sound had nowhere else to go. The man's face was flushed now. He had walked on earlier with the quiet confidence of someone used to being admired. The crew had greeted him by name, the way they did for important passengers. People had noticed his watch, his tailored suit, the way he carried himself. But all of that seemed to shrink under the weight of his child's endless crying. He rubbed his forehead, muttered under his breath, and shifted again, trying to calm the little one as sweat beaded on his temples. Minutes stretched long. The plane had not even taken off, and the tension was already filling the cabin. A woman in the row behind whispered to her husband, "This is going to be a nightmare." A man further back closed his laptop in frustration. One of the attendants placed a hand gently on the father's shoulder and said, "Sir, we'll do our best to help, but sometimes babies just need time." Her voice was kind, but her eyes revealed the worry of knowing the rest of the passengers would not be so patient. The father leaned back, exhaling sharply. For a moment, the child's wail softened, but then, as if on cue, another wave of crying began, louder than before. Heads shook. A few people groaned openly. And in that tense atmosphere, the father's wealth and status felt meaningless. He was simply another parent on a crowded flight, powerless against the cries of his child. It was then that another figure caught the attention of a few nearby passengers. A boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old, sat quietly in the economy section just a few rows behind first class. His clothes were simple, worn at the edges, the kind of outfit that looked like it had seen many hand-me-downs. His eyes, however, were steady, watching the scene unfold. While the adults around him shifted uncomfortably, he didn't flinch. He seemed to be listening differently, as if the sound of the baby's cries wasn't an irritation to him but something he understood. The father hadn't noticed him yet. He was too caught up in his own embarrassment, glancing around at the restless passengers who looked at him with a mix of sympathy and irritation. He whispered apologies, though his voice carried little weight over the noise. For a man who likely had power in boardrooms and offices, here on this plane, he had none. As the crew began preparing for takeoff, the baby's crying showed no sign of stopping. Some passengers had already pulled out eye masks, trying to block the noise before it ruined the entire flight. The father closed his eyes and rocked the baby again, though his hands trembled slightly. And still, through the hum and the sighs and the crying, the boy in the back kept watching. He leaned forward a little, resting his chin on his hand, eyes fixed on the struggling father. No one noticed him yet. No one expected him to matter. He was just a poor kid, traveling alone, probably overlooked like the worn edges of his shirt. But the look on his face was different from the others. Where the passengers carried irritation, his expression carried something else, something calm, something patient, something waiting. And as the engines roared to life and the plane began to move, the boy's eyes didn't waver. The plane lifted into the sky, tilting gently as it climbed higher. Outside the window, clouds stretched like endless fields of white, but inside the cabin, there was no peace. The baby's cries rose and fell in sharp waves, filling the narrow space, pressing into every ear. A woman across the aisle shook her head and muttered, "Why can't he control this child?" Her words weren't loud, but they carried, sharp enough for the father to hear. He closed his eyes for a moment, jaw tightening, but said nothing. He tried everything, rubbing the baby's back, offering a bottle, softly humming, but nothing seemed to work. The child squirmed and kicked, face red and damp with tears. The father's expensive tie hung loose now, and his polished shoes tapped restlessly against the floor. The once confident man seemed smaller, hunched over in his seat, weighed down not only by the baby but by the eyes of strangers judging him. Every few minutes, a flight attendant stopped by. "Sir, is there anything else we can bring?" one asked kindly. He only shook his head. "I've tried everything," he whispered, his voice cracking with frustration. "Everything." She gave him a sympathetic smile before moving on, but the whispers and sighs from the passengers did not fade. In the rows behind, the boy kept watching. His seatmate, an older man with headphones, noticed him leaning forward again and frowned. "Kid, just ignore it. It's not your problem," he muttered before returning to his screen. But the boy didn't move back. He tilted his head, as though listening more carefully, as if the baby's cries were a language only he could understand. The father shifted the baby again, bouncing gently, but his patience was slipping. "Please, please, just stop," he whispered desperately to the child, though the words were more for himself than the baby. His suit jacket had been pushed aside, his shirt wrinkled. He was sweating now, pulling at his collar as though the cabin air had turned heavy. The crying rattled in his head, making him feel trapped, exposed, helpless in a way he hadn't felt in years. From the corner of his eye, he noticed people staring. One man had even taken out his phone, holding it low, recording discreetly. The thought burned through him, "They'll see me like this, they'll see me failing." He shifted the baby again, more quickly now, his movements restless. The baby only cried harder. The boy unbuckled his seatbelt quietly. His heart beat faster, though his face stayed calm. He glanced at the attendants in the aisle. They were busy serving drinks up front, not looking in his direction. He stood slowly, holding onto the seat in front of him for balance. His small frame moved carefully down the aisle, unnoticed at first. When he reached the curtain separating economy from first class, one of the attendants finally saw him. "Sweetheart, you need to stay in your seat," she said gently, stepping toward him. The boy froze, eyes darting toward the crying baby. I think I can help," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the noise. The attendant blinked, surprised. She glanced back at the father, who was rubbing his forehead with one hand, rocking the baby with the other, looking like a man at the edge of breaking. She hesitated, then crouched to the boy's level. "Help? How?" she asked, lowering her voice. The boy swallowed, nervous but steady. "Sometimes babies cry because they don't feel safe. I know how to hold them. My little sister used to cry like that. I can help him calm down." His eyes didn't waver. The attendant steadied him for a moment, torn between rules and the desperation in the air. Behind her, the baby screamed again, and the father let out a sound that was half sigh, half groan. She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right." But carefully. The boy's eyes lit up, and he stepped past the curtain. The passengers nearest to him looked confused, some even annoyed. What could this skinny, poor-looking boy do that the wealthy father and the trained attendants couldn't? Yet he walked forward, small steps carrying quiet certainty. The father looked up, startled to see a stranger, a child, standing in front of him. His brows furrowed. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. The boy glanced at the baby, then back at him. His voice was calm. "I think I can help." The father stared at him, disbelief etched on his face. For a moment, he almost laughed at the absurdity. But then another sharp cry from his child cut through his chest, and he realized he had nothing left to lose. The father hesitated, torn between pride and exhaustion. His instinct was to dismiss the boy, to wave him away like an annoyance. But as another piercing cry shook the cabin, his defenses cracked. He looked down at his son, red-faced and trembling, then back at the boy who stood patiently, his hands at his sides, waiting without fear. For the first time since boarding, the father's shoulders slumped. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low, worn thin. "Go ahead. Try." The boy nodded once, not in triumph but in quiet understanding. He stepped closer, extending his arms carefully. The passengers around leaned in, curiosity sparking. Phones tilted upward, recording. Some whispered, "What's he doing?" Others shook their heads, convinced it would only get worse. The father handed the baby over with trembling hands, his jaw tight as though he couldn't believe what he was doing. The boy took the child gently, cradling him against his chest. His movements weren't rushed or uncertain, they carried a kind of practiced calm. The baby squirmed at first, letting out another wail, but the boy held firm, rocking gently side to side. His hand rubbed the baby's back in small circles, his head bent low as he hummed softly under his breath. The sound was so quiet that only those closest could hear it. It wasn't a song from the radio or something learned in school, it was a tune that carried warmth, the kind of melody passed down in families, sung in dim rooms when children couldn't sleep. The baby's cries hitched, pausing between sobs, as though listening. The father's eyes widened. He leaned forward, his lips parted, watching every movement. Around him, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The boy's voice stayed low, steady, humming that same tune again and again. Slowly, the baby's sobs softened, the sharp edges dulling to whimpers. Within moments, the cries faded into soft hiccups, and then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, silence. The baby nestled against the boy's chest, eyes fluttering shut. The shift was so sudden it felt unreal. Just minutes ago, the noise had filled every corner of the plane, pressing into ears and nerves. Now, there was only the faint hum of the engines and the boy's quiet melody. Passengers stared, stunned. A woman in the aisle whispered, "Unbelievable." A man across the row let out a low whistle. Someone further back muttered, "How did he do that?" The father sat frozen, his hand hovering in midair as though afraid to break the spell. His mouth moved but no words came. He looked around, seeing the stares of other passengers now aimed not at him, but at the boy holding his child. For the first time that day, those stares carried no judgment, only awe. The boy didn't look up. He kept rocking slowly, whispering a soft rhythm under his breath, his eyes fixed on the tiny face now calm against his shirt. His hands were steady, his posture relaxed, as though this was the most natural thing in the world. The flight attendant who had stopped him earlier stood nearby, her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes glistened. She glanced at the father, who looked back at her, both silently acknowledging what they had just witnessed. A long minute passed before the boy finally looked up. His gaze met the father's, quiet but steady. He whispered, he just needed to feel safe. That's all. The father swallowed hard, words tangled in his throat. He wanted to speak, thank him, question him, say something, but his voice betrayed him. All he could do was nod, his eyes wet, his chest heavy with a strange mix of shame and gratitude. The passengers, one by one, began to shift back into their seats, though the whispers didn't stop. Phones clicked off, but the memory of what they had seen stayed alive in the air. The cabin had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by something softer, almost reverent. The boy gently adjusted the baby in his arms, careful not to wake him. The father leaned forward, his hands clasped together, still staring as though afraid the silence would shatter any second. But it didn't. The baby slept on, breathing steady, completely at peace. The boy finally asked, "Do you want me to keep holding him for a while?" His voice was simple, without pride. The father blinked, as though waking from a dream. "Yes," he whispered. "Please." The boy shifted carefully in his seat at the edge of the aisle, still holding the baby close. His hands didn't shake, his shoulders didn't strain. He rocked gently, almost like he'd done this hundreds of times before. The baby stirred once, a soft whimper breaking the silence, but the boy's hum started again, steady and patient, and within seconds the child slipped back into sleep. Passengers leaned over their seats, some pretending not to stare, others shamelessly watching. One woman whispered to her husband, "Can you believe that?" The millionaire couldn't stop his own baby, but this boy, her voice trailed off, amazement painted across her face. Another passenger shook his head and muttered, "Money can't buy everything, huh?" The father sat in his wide leather seat, his expensive suit creased, his cufflinks glinting faintly under the cabin lights. But all the shine of wealth seemed meaningless now. His eyes stayed fixed on the boy and his son. He had walked onto this plane a man who owned rooms with his presence, who commanded attention with the flash of his watch and the sharpness of his words. Yet here, beside a boy who had nothing, he felt small. For the first time since the crying began, he exhaled without tension. He rubbed his face with both hands, leaned back, and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, his gaze softened, humbled in a way he wasn't used to. The flight attendant approached quietly, crouching near the boy. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "What's your name?" The boy looked up briefly. "David," he said softly. "Well, David," she continued, smiling warmly, "I think you've just saved this entire flight." Her tone carried genuine gratitude, not the polite courtesy she usually gave passengers. She glanced at the father, who nodded silently, still unable to form words. More than once, the baby stirred, but each time David swayed gently, his hum weaving into the rhythm of the engines. It wasn't just the baby who was coming, the entire cabin seemed to sink into an unexpected peace. Conversation softened. Passengers settled back into their seats. The air, once thick with frustration, carried something new, something almost tender. The father finally leaned forward. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "How did you know what to do?" David glanced at him, then back at the baby. "My little sister," he said simply. "When she was a baby, she cried all the time. My mom worked nights, so I learned how to help her sleep. She liked this tune. It always worked." The father blinked, taken aback. He had expected some complicated explanation, some trick or secret. Instead, it was simple, rooted in experience and necessity. A boy who had so little had given more comfort to his child in a few minutes than he himself had managed in hours. He leaned back, guilt gnawing at him. For years, he had prided himself on control, on being the man who always had the solution, the money, the answer. But here, none of that mattered. All it took was a boy with no title, no wealth, no position, just patience and love. David didn't look for recognition. He didn't bask in the attention. He just kept humming, his small voice steady, his eyes soft as the baby breathed against him. The passengers began to talk again, quieter this time, but every so often their eyes flicked toward the boy. Some smiled. Some shook their heads, still amazed. A few pulled out their phones again, not to record chaos, but to capture the unlikely calm of a poor boy cradling a millionaire's child. The father saw the phones and for the first time didn't care. He wasn't embarrassed now, he was simply humbled. Watching his son rest so peacefully against David's chest, he felt something shift inside him. He leaned forward again, his voice lower, almost uncertain. "David, thank you." The boy looked at him briefly, nodded once, and returned his gaze to the baby. His silence said more than words ever could. The hum of the engines filled the silence as the plane settled into its long path through the sky. The baby's breathing had evened out now, steady and calm against David's chest. For a while, nothing but the low vibration of flight and the soft murmur of passengers filled the air. It felt almost unreal after the storm of crying that had shaken everyone earlier. The father leaned back in his seat, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He kept stealing glances at David, each one stirring something different inside him, gratitude, confusion, even shame. He had spent his whole life building an image of control and authority, but in this moment, he was watching a boy no older than 13 accomplish what he could not. It unsettled him in a way money couldn't fix. Across the aisle, an older woman leaned forward and whispered, "That boy is a miracle." Her words were met with nods. The man behind her spoke louder, not caring who heard, rich or not, that father should be grateful. That kid saved the whole plane. His tone wasn't cruel, but it cut through the father like a blade. He pressed his lips together, resisting the urge to respond. He knew they were right. The flight attendant walked by again, pausing to look at David and the sleeping baby. "Unbelievable," she murmured softly before carrying on with her tray. The passengers weren't just calmer, their attitudes had shifted. Where frustration once ruled, now there was a quiet respect. But that respect wasn't aimed at the wealthy father. It was drawn toward the boy who had stepped out of nowhere and changed everything. David adjusted the baby gently, one hand cupped under the child's head. He didn't fidget, didn't act uncomfortable, didn't show the strain of holding a heavy toddler in his arms. He sat there with a calm that felt older than his years, like he had carried responsibilities far bigger than his frame long before this flight. The father finally leaned closer, speaking low so only David could hear. "You must be used to this." David shrugged slightly. "I had to be," he answered. His tone was simple, almost matter-of-fact. "When my mom worked, I took care of my sister. Sometimes she'd cry all night, but after a while, I learned what helped." He glanced at the baby, then added softly, "You just have to be patient. You can't rush it." The father swallowed hard. Patience was not something he had practiced much. His life was built on schedules, deadlines, and deals that demanded results. Waiting felt like weakness. Yet here was a boy, barely in his teens, reminding him that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do was simply wait and hold on. For the first time since the flight began, the father's gaze softened fully. He wasn't just grateful, he was humbled. He felt the weight of his own pride pressing against him, and he didn't like what it revealed. Passengers continued to watch from time to time, their eyes flicking between the father and the boy. Some whispered quietly, others smiled at the sight of the baby finally sleeping. Every so often, a camera phone lifted discreetly, capturing the scene. A man 2 rows back whispered to his companion, "That clip's going viral, just wait." The father heard the words and felt a shiver of unease. The thought of the world watching this moment unsettled him, but then he looked at David again. The boy wasn't doing it for attention. He wasn't even aware of the whispers or the phones. His entire focus was on the child in his arms, rocking softly, humming faintly. It struck the father how rare that was. In his world, everything had a price, everything was done for recognition or reward. But here was a boy with nothing, giving everything without expecting a single thing in return. The father let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For the first time in years, he felt small in the best way, not diminished, but reminded of something bigger than himself. He sat back, his eyes fixed on his son and the boy who had stilled his cries. The silence was no longer heavy. It was healing. The father leaned forward again, his elbows resting on his knees. He steadied David, really steadied him this time. The boy's shirt was faded, his sneakers scuffed, his small hand steady against the baby's back. Nothing about him spoke of privilege or comfort, and yet, in this moment, he held a kind of power the father couldn't name. "You said your mom worked nights," the father said quietly, careful not to disturb the baby. "What about your dad?" David's eyes flicked toward him, then back down to the sleeping child. "He's not around," he answered simply. There was no anger in his voice, no self-pity, just a quiet acceptance. "It's just me, my mom, and my sister." The father nodded slowly, though something in his chest tightened. He thought of his own wealth, the mansions, the cars, the staff hired to take care of things so he never had to. Yet here was a boy who had learned responsibility not because he wanted to, but because life demanded it. "You're strong," the father murmured. The words slipped out before he could stop them. David glanced up at him, surprised, then gave a small shrug. I just do what I have to, he said softly. The passengers nearby were pretending to sleep or read, but their ears were sharp. They could feel the shift happening, the way the father's tone carried something new, something vulnerable. The man who had once walked onto the plane with his chin high and his suit immaculate now sounded like he was learning, not leading. David shifted the baby slightly, patting his back with gentle rhythm. The baby's tiny sigh escaped, a soft sound that made the father close his eyes briefly. Relief washed over him again, but this time it wasn't just because the crying had stopped. It was because he had been given a gift, a reminder of what really mattered, handed to him by someone the world often overlooked. You know, the father said after a pause, I've spent years building companies, closing deals, making money. People respect me for it. They think I have answers. He stopped, staring at the floor for a moment. But today, I had nothing. And you, he lifted his eyes to David, you had everything I didn't. David blinked at him, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to adults speaking like that, especially men like this one, men in tailored suits with watches that cost more than his family's yearly rent. He looked down, embarrassed, and whispered, it's not a big deal. Anyone could do it. The father almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, he said firmly, shaking his head. Not anyone. Not me. Not them. He gestured faintly to the passengers, some of whom quickly averted their eyes. You're the only one who stepped up. David's cheeks flushed. He shifted again in his seat, uncomfortable with the weight of attention. He had acted because it was natural to him, not because he wanted praise. The father could see that, and it humbled him even more. The boy looked at the baby, then back at the father. His voice was quiet but clear. He just needed love. That's all. The words struck deeper than the father expected. They echoed in his mind, simple but undeniable. He thought of his boardrooms, his speeches, his wealth. None of it mattered in this moment. None of it had mattered when his child needed him most. He leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time, he felt the sting of humility not as shame but as a lesson. A boy with nothing had reminded him of the one thing money could never buy, love freely given. Around them, the passengers had fallen into silence again, sensing the weight of the exchange. The baby shifted, then settled deeper into sleep, his tiny hand resting against David's shirt. And for the first time since the plane left the ground, the father smiled, not the polished smile he used in meetings, but something real, small, and raw. The father sat back, the leather seat swallowing him, but he didn't feel grand in it anymore. For years, he had measured his worth by the weight of his wallet, the size of his contracts, the applause he earned in rooms filled with powerful people. Yet none of that mattered here, on this plane thousands of feet above the ground. What mattered was a boy with steady hands and a quiet song, who had soothed his crying child when all his wealth had failed him. The baby's small chest rose and fell against David's shirt, his tiny hand clutching the fabric as if it had always belonged there. David didn't move much, only enough to keep the rhythm steady, his eyes soft and his hum low. Passengers glanced over again and again, some still shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling faintly as if reminded of something they had forgotten long ago. The father leaned closer, his voice lower, careful not to wake his son. David, he said slowly, almost as if testing the name. Do you know what you've done here? David looked at him, puzzled. I just helped him stop crying, he said plainly. The father shook his head. No. You didn't just.